So we are getting to a point where, like an inflection point, where I think the debt that our national government holds is going to increasingly be affecting the activities of day-to-day Americans. I mean, when you've got a government that can't pay its bills, that crowds out other virtuous spending. Here's what I mean. In the last 10 years, we spent $3 trillion just on interest on the debt. Now, no veteran got a new knee for that money. No student got a free school lunch with that money. That's just interest on the debt. In the next 10 years, though, because we're hitting this inflection point, we're not going to spend $3 trillion on interest on the debt. We're going to spend $10 trillion on interest on the debt. That is going to crowd out all of the kinds of virtuous spending that we know that we believe in, like veterans health care, like free school lunches for poor American kids. This is when it's really going to impact Americans, when our government has a limited ability to borrow yet more money from the Chinese, and as a result, reduced ability to make good the promises we made to Americans.
It's important for government operations. You know, to simply win the Revolutionary War, our government had to go into debt. We had to borrow a lot more money to fight and win World War II. But there are times when it's probably not so wise to have taken on that debt without taxing people to pay it back. One example in my lifetime was the Vietnam War, where we had more than enough money in our country to actually tax wealthy people to pay for the war in Vietnam, but we were not willing to do it, and so we built up debt there. And there are other times when we simply, we want to pay more in federal benefits than we're willing to tax the people that have money in our country. And it's a mistake to just, whenever someone says, oh, we have this debt, $25 trillion in publicly held debt, you have to compare that to the wealth that you have. And so not many people are aware of it, but the total wealth of the United States is very much larger than our debt. The wealth of American citizens is about $140 trillion. So if you have $140 trillion and $25 trillion of government debt, we're not anywhere near bankrupt as a country.
So when you've got a federal government that is buying up more and more and more debt, I mean, the laws of supply and demand still hold firm. So if the government is sucking up all of the people who want to loan somebody money, if all of the loaners of money are loaning money to the federal government, that impacts their ability, the available capital that's left for others to be able to borrow money. It does have an impact. It also has an impact on the rate, supply and demand. When you've got a lot more demand for interest, for debt, that increases the cost of that debt. That does impact everyday Americans as well.
Government debt is one of the main tools that we use to control interest rates. And so when interest rates are elevated, what happens, it becomes harder to buy a new house or to finance a car or so on. And that causes the amount of spending in the economy to slow down because there are ways that an economy can run too hot or run too cold. You run too cold when you're in a downturn or a Great Depression, where everyone stops spending and then all of the companies go out of business because no one's buying their products, and then they fire the workers and their workers don't have any money, and you can go into a downward spiral. You can equally well go to an upward spiral where there's too much money chasing around too few products. And that can be caused either because there is a lot of money that's been put into the economy, or because there are not enough products to go around. We saw that at the end of COVID.
We know that when government spends too much money, not necessarily borrows too much money, although there's an effect there too, but when government spends too much money, when you basically create too much cash, that's the definition of inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. And so too much government spending, like we have seen, I think most economists agree, over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, that creates inflation or hyperinflation, which absolutely is basically reducing the purchasing power for every American family.
It depends a lot on, first, who it is that you tax, and secondly, who benefits from the money and the way that the government spends money. A lot of the benefits only come around over time. For example, after World War II, we ended up World War II with a lot of debt And so we could have said, okay, our first priority is let's pay off all the debt and just do everything we can and do nothing new. But the greatest generation that fought World War II realized there were better uses of government resources. And so they had, for example, the GI Bill that basically provided free job training or college education to all the soldiers that came back. And that was something that cost the government more money. We had to go more deeply into debt, but people study that, and that the taxpayer got their money back 7 times over from the money that we spent on the GI Bill. And the same thing is true today.
There is a real risk, a clear and present risk that people like Moody's or Standards and Poor's that assess the creditworthiness of companies and individuals is going to say, America is no longer a very low credit risk. That's a little riskier than it used to be. And so they could downgrade our credit rating. That in effect will make the expense of us servicing our debt higher, which again will just crowd out more virtuous spending that we should be spending our dollars on rather than on debt service.
The point is we're very far from bankrupt. And one of the worst things that we can do is threaten the world that we're going to default on our debt, ruin our credit rating, and cause chaos in the financial systems and huge damage to our reputation. The tragedy, of course, is that if we didn't have the money to pay it off, that would be one thing, but we do. We just have chosen to park most of the wealth in the pockets of the top few percent in our country.
So our debt is big because the public, and by extension the politicians, want more things than they're willing to pay for. So we want about $6.3 trillion worth of goods and services from our federal government every year, but we only want to pay about $4.9 trillion for them. And that being upside down $1.4 trillion every year is absolutely having a serious impact on our strength as a country. Much of the growth in discretionary spending has come in the last 2 years. Discretionary spending is up 35% in just the last 2 years. And so I do think step one needs to be right sizing that discretionary spending. If we could just return next year's discretionary spending levels to what we were spending in 2022, that's just 5 months ago. If we could just do that, we would save $1.5 trillion over the 10-year window. That is one very tangible, very reasonable, very easy thing that we could do today.
It seems to come and go in waves, whether or not we're willing to tax those fortunate enough to either inherit wealth or to become very wealthy themselves. And so what happens if you're not willing to do that, as we have not in the recent past, but have in the historic past? We used to have one tax bracket, for example, that only applied to one family, the Rockefellers, and it was over 90%, the marginal rate on the extremely wealthy people. And it seemed not to destroy our economy. I mean, those were the years where the U.S. economy took over leadership in the world. And so that this is sort of proven historically not to be destructive to the wealth of a country, to have high tax rates on those fortunate enough to have inherited or produced enormous wealth. The generation that fought in World War II, they understood what had to be done to pay off the debt, and it was under their leadership and their control that we actually had the very high tax rates that allowed us to pay off the enormous debt that we had coming out of World War II. I'm a member of the boomers, and I have to say the boomers are maybe the least great generation in that and just time after time, we tend to be a little more selfish than we are, not understanding how fortunate we were to inherit the country that we inherited, but being unwilling to tax ourselves to make sure that the next generation gets the education and the clean environment and everything else that they deserve.